Hi everyone, today I'm gonna share with you this Stay Wet palette by Nik Pro. I really like using Stay Wet palettes when I use either acrylic paint or gouache or acrylic gouache. It's very convenient. It really helps me save paint. Also, instead of throwing it away when I'm done with my session, or if I'm interrupted and I have to stop painting and start again later on, it keeps my paint fresh. So Nik Pro sent me their palette to review and share with you. It actually comes with a lot of things, something too that it's good for, and I've seen that before. Those palettes are great when you paint miniatures, like little figurines. There's a lot of stuff in the box. First, there's a bunch of palette paper. They're called hydration paper sheets, and there's 100 of them, and they're cut to the size of the palette. I'll show you in a little while. There's some instructions to follow, and we'll get back to them also later. There are 4 foam pads, and those foam pads, they're the little sponges that you use to keep your paint hydrated. And then there's the palette. So there's it looks like 3 levels. Let's see. Oh, this one was tough to open. So you've got a little brush holder. And you have a palette also. First of all, this palette and everything that is included is certified non-toxic and safe for home use. Now, when you want to start using it, you need to rinse the sponge thoroughly before your first use to remove any residue. And then the sponge is going to extend and cover the bottom of your palette. Then you need to wet both sides of the paper and lay on top. That way it's going to lay flat. If you start seeing it curl up, it's because it's drying up, so you can wet the sponge again. And if you're done with your session, your painting session, you can take the very top of it and just close them, and it's going to retain the moisture, and your paint is going to stay fresh. Now be careful, because depending on the paint that you use, if there's too much water, then your paint is going to start being very watery, and you might not want that. I've learned how to use the right amount of water on my sponge so that I can have the right consistency with my paint, but it's a matter of trial and errors, and use it and know what you're looking for. Now, as you saw, it comes with a palette with wells. You can put some brushes here if you want. You know, there's many ways, or mixing area, there's many ways to use it. My concern was like, how, if you use this as a palette and mix your paint and all, or just to have all your paints ready, how do you keep this fresh? Because your sponge is underneath. You don't want to have it upside down or have this on top, because it's going to make a big mess. You know, you put this back here when you put it all away, and you put the lid back on. Those two compartments, they're not linked whatsoever, so there's no humidity going into the paint in the wells. So I'm not quite sure what the plan was with this. So I'm thinking what could be done if you're using this area is to cut a piece of this sponge here and keep it wet here. That way when you close the lid, you will have some humidity in there and keep your paint in the wells still moist. So I think that's what I might do. Now I must say that these boxes, when you close the lid and all, they're really tight. It's pretty tricky, or pretty hard to open, but that means that there is no air going in, or probably not much, so it's pretty tight. So that's kind of neat. And if you want it even tighter, you can put the elastic band on it. So I'm pretty excited to try this out, and I think I'm gonna use it to paint with some acrylic gouache. So I'm gonna have to figure out what I'm gonna paint, and then I'll get started. So stay tuned. I rinsed the foam pad thoroughly as per the instructions. Get it wet, not too wet, and I put the paper palette on top of it. Then I selected all my colors, put them all on the paper palette. And for this painting, I took my time on purpose. So once I was done putting all the paint on the palette, I closed it and I waited about an hour or two before I started painting. Just wanted to see how fresh the paint would be. The paint looked nice. There was no dry film on top. It looked like I had just poured them out of the tubes. So I started painting. I did my first layer. The paint was nice and creamy. It's the Turner acrylic gouache that I'm using. I really like it. And as I was painting, even without the lid on to keep the paint fresh, because of the moisture from underneath the paper palette, the paint didn't dry. Only the areas of mixed paint that were very, very thin started drying a little bit, which is normal because there was barely any paint there. Now, if you're considering buying a Stay Wet palette, consider that there are many ways to use it. And all the reviews you're going to read might depend on how people use them. All of them, as far as I'm concerned, work pretty well, as long as you know how to use them. So for me, because of the nature of the paint I'm using, I usually keep the sponge or the foam pad moist but not soaking wet, because I found that if the sponge is too wet and I close the lid, it's going to retain too much moisture and it's going to liquefy the paint. And I do not like that consistency. It ends up being too thin and the paint loses its opacity. But I found that as long as there is some moisture, it keeps the paint fresh, and I really like that. I actually use it also when I use regular gouache, even though that's a kind of paint that re-wets, even after it's dry, because it tends to just not dry and keep it fresh. And I would rather paint with fresh gouache than dry gouache that I re-wet. So after I was done with my first layer, I used a little spray bottle and I misted the paint with water and then I closed the lid. The goal was to keep it like that for several days. Not because of my painting process or anything, again to test the palette. So I closed the palette and I left it alone for 3 days. I did not touch it, I didn't open it, I didn't look at it. I left it on its own. After 3 days, when I was ready to paint again, I opened the palette and the paint was still fresh. It actually looked a bit more liquid, but I think that's because I had sprayed a little bit too much water. It was just the top of it though. The rest of it was still nice and fresh as if I had poured it out of the tube, so it was great. I just wiped the more liquid parts around my little globs of paint and I could start painting again. On the lid you can see all the water droplets that kept everything nice and fresh. So to me, that test was great. I'm sure I could have kept that paint fresh for many more days. Like I mentioned earlier, the way you keep it fresh is really a matter of trial and errors. Figure it out as you paint and what works best for you. Now, I was talking about different ways of using your Stay Wet palette. I've seen people painting miniatures, like little soldiers and all. And I'm not familiar with the paint that they use, but I've seen videos where they use their Stay Wet palette and they actually soak the sponge like a lot. And it's almost floating in the water inside their palette, which really surprised me, but I've seen several people do the same thing, so it must be working for them. That's definitely not how it works for me. That would be way too much water for me. So again, it really depends on what you're using it for. Now I was trying to figure out different ways to use that Nik Pro palette, and actually if you're painting a larger painting, this one is really small, it's 5 by 7 inches. But if you're painting something bigger and you need a lot more paint, you could use actually the bottom portion and the top portion, the lid, as two different Stay Wet palettes. Or one with the paint that you're going to need for a while for your painting, and one with paint that you will refresh. But since you have different foam pads, you can use them at the same time in two different trays, which is great. The part with the wells, you can use that as a dry palette if you need to, or, and I'm sure it would work as a wet palette as well if you just put a smaller portion of the sponge in it. And that way you might have 2 layers of Stay Wet palettes, the bottom part that you close with the palette that has wells, and then you put the lid on the very top. I hope that makes sense. But yeah, you have a lot of different options with this Nik Pro Stay Wet palette, and I'm really happy with it. And now with the bit that I really liked, it's the actual paper palette itself, what they call the hydration paper sheets. I've used several brands, and the papers are made out of, I'm not sure what exactly, but they're not really waterproof. So as they get more and more moist, they tend to tear. So if you're working on a mix and keep on adding to that mix over and over again, eventually that part of the paper will tear and you have paint on your sponge underneath. And it's not much fun. So I've stopped using those papers, and what I do instead is usually I use my ceramic palette, a flat palette on top of it, and it's good enough for keeping the paint wet. But with the hydration paper or the paper palette that comes with the Nik Pro set, it's more of a waxy paper, and so I was able to mix some paint in the same areas over and over again, and it never broke, it never tore. it's great. It's really good quality, in my opinion, at least for the technique that I use. So I'm very happy with that paper. I really like it a lot. So I'm going to be back using that paper over and over again when I use this palette. So overall, it was a great experience. Thank you very much, Nik Pro, for sending me this palette to try. I really liked it. Yes, the lid is a bit hard to open, but I think that's what makes it nice and airtight. So I can deal with that. I hope you guys liked this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. If you're feeling extra generous and would like to support this channel, you can always click on the thanks button right next to the share button. Have a wonderful day, everyone. I'll see you soon with another video. Bye bye.